Morning, everyone. Welcome to ED&A. Seeing as it is 9:01, I'm going to request that Senator Perkins Coker lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Sure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's not snowing finally, for a few minutes anyway. I think we've got a few hours we can get through and without any white stuff falling. So we'll get right to work, and we're going to start with Senate Bill 87. And I will recognize Senator Ward to introduce the bill. Good morning, Senator.
Members of the committee, I am Senator Ruth Ward from District 8, and I'm here this morning to present Senate Bill 87 for your consideration. It has to do with being able to provide medical personnel and nurses for youth camps and other similar activities. This bill allows certain nurse practitioners and other medical personnel to practice in youth camps, organized recreation, and community-sponsored recreation settings. I think you're all aware of that youth camps and similar activities are not the only ones looking for qualified personnel. We've had a shortage of nursing staff many places, and this is another organization that is also looking for qualified staff. And this bill hopes to make that a little bit easier. You have before you an amended version that just came from OLS this morning. So if you have read the original bill, some things have been added to this amended version. So I'd like you to take a look at it and read it. So if you have any questions, there will be people behind me who know much more about the situation at camps than I do. And they are here to provide you with more information.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. So it looks like you've added nurse practitioners and physicians, which was the recommendation of one of the emails we've got.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, how about now? That better? It looks like you've added in your amendment the nurse practitioners to the physicians line, which was one of the email testimonies. Is there any other substantive changes in the amendment?
You should have the amendment right there. They have added qualified medical personnel.
Yeah, okay.
And having something to do with the licensing of nurses, graduate nurses, if they can be licensed to practice for a certain length of time. So there are some changes that I think should be interesting to you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Senator Ward? Seeing none, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, guess we'll start at the top. Polly Campion is speaking, and she's in neutral position. She's from the New Hampshire Nurses Association. Good morning. Welcome to ED&A.
Thank you, and good morning, Chair Pearl and members of the committee. Some familiar faces here. My name is Polly Campion, and I'm a registered nurse and a former state representative. So I'm familiar with the surroundings at any rate. I'm here today, however, on behalf of the New Hampshire Nurses Association. And the Nurses Association is very invested in increasing the number of qualified nurses of all stripes in all settings across the state. And so are very grateful to Senator Ward for having submitted this bill, however, have some concerns about the language. And I've had just a moment to review the amendment, and some of those concerns still apply. I think you have a copy of a packet that has a letter from the New Hampshire Nurses Association signed by Pam DiNapoli. And in all fair disclosure, she is the expert on camp nursing, having served as a camp nurse. And she's the immediate past executive director of the Nurses Association. She was not available today, so she asked me to come in her stead. The concerns that still apply, even in the amendment, have to do, and if we look at the amendment, line 8, and it repeats itself in multiple paragraphs, allows any qualified person who's applied for a license to have a temporary license for no more than 100 days. And if we think about the duration of most camp seasons during the summer, it may result in there being no fully licensed person for the full duration of the camp season, which could be roughly 100 days. So there are some concerns, and that, as I said, it reflects it. That's reflected in several paragraphs. One of the other things that is in your packet included the clinical practice advisory regarding camp nursing from the New Hampshire Board of Nursing. And when speaking about licensure, the first line is critical in that it states, to practice nursing in New Hampshire, you must hold an active New Hampshire license or multi-state license from another compact state. And the bill as written and as amended grants temporary license to people in a number of different settings. So I think the sort of what I would really conclude with is that there are some specific changes that could be useful, but I think that there needs to be a little bit more time for the interested parties to come together and propose language that maintains the quality and competency of the staff that care for children or others who may be attending camp. So my suggestion and request at this point would be to hold on execing this bill until further work can be done to create another amendment. And I'm happy to try to answer questions if you have any.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your service to the state. And it's fun being a rep, isn't it?
It's one of the most fascinating things I've ever done.
Awesome. Any questions from the Senator Altshuler? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And
Good
thank you,
morning,
Honorable
Senator.
Campion, for coming back. It's nice to see you back here.
You as well.
Can you walk me through where I'm looking at all of, probably too many pieces of paper here and looking for the original statute. Where's the 100 days? This is not in the amendment has
amendment.
100 days. I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Is the concern that, I mean, having not been too far out of summer camp days and having young adults who have worked in long-term summer camps, the needs of campers have changed dramatically. And it's not unusual for just a run-of-the-mill fun camp, not something even, a super one sport for all summer, but a kind of a liberal arts camp, if you will, to have students or campers who have type 1 diabetes, who have severe allergies to environmental things and food allergies, and to have complex medical needs with autoimmune diseases. And we also now have the added burden on entire camps to manage the possibility of COVID being introduced to camp. So is there, that said, is there objection from the Nurses Association about section 4, line 19 in the amendment? And are we talking about them? Are we entertaining the amendment right now? Are we talking about, what are we doing?
Well,
I don't want to address the wrong thing.
Sure. I mean, the amendment was introduced by the sponsor, so
Yeah.
we can kind of look at it all.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Yes. So if we're going, all right, we're going to go straight there. 19. Any nurse previously licensed in New Hampshire in the last 3 years whose license is no longer active may serve. Is there any concern that they may not be updated on best practices within that 3-year period?
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
okay?
Yeah. And and also, if they haven't been practicing for 3 years, many people, many of us, give up our licenses or no longer renew our licenses for a variety of reasons. And it may be that it's too much of a challenge to maintain competency practice hours. It may be that we lost some skills at the end of our career. But I think that what each of these paragraphs has in common, and the special allowances for nurses who are not actively licensed, the concern is similar, in that our belief is there needs to be an assessment of an individual when he or she is applying for licensure to ensure that they have the necessary skills, education, and competencies to safely care for kids and for humans. And one of the things you mentioned how much more complex care is in camp. It's similar to the increasing complexity that is occurring in schools. And school nurses take on much greater responsibilities these days. And the difference between camp nurses and school nurses is that the camp nurses are also responsible for all the staff. So there are adults there that, and there are cardiac events that occur, et cetera. So I think good start, additional work needs to be done.
Senator Perkins Quokka.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I know you're requesting more time, so I don't want to get into all the details of it, but I do just note, one of your comments is that, temporary licenses are available, though the potential licensees have to be supervised by a registered nurse. And I know in other fields, we've heard about the challenges of sort of having a supervisor, for clinical practice, for experiential practice. So I just wondered if, in your further discussions, whether you guys have explored, sort of the challenges of that supervision, and whether you've, you think that the safety of patients can still be met with some other more flexible supervision models.
That has come up for discussion. I don't know that there's been a conclusion, honestly.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of the, this is according to the Board of Nursing rules, requiring a graduate nurse. There is a designation for a graduate nurse who is somebody who has graduated from nursing school, taken the nursing boards, but has not yet been given their license. But they do require supervision by an RN. And I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe there is a requirement in camp that the registered nurse be available 24/7 for supervision. So it's not an off-site kind of thing. Okay. But yes, we need to be more flexible. The challenge is always to increase flexibility, but to maintain competency and safety.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Any further questions? Oh, Senator Altshuler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking another question.
I'll do my best.
I have not had the time to, because I just got this now, to really digest all of your paperwork that comes in. But you did mention in your testimony that 100 days as a short-term temporary license. I agree with you. Camps go for much longer than 100 days, particularly because camps have to set up and break down, and those camp nurses are responsible for those staff in the setup and breakdown. So it's more like 120 to 130 days sometimes, in my personal experience. Maybe there are some camps that do it quick and dirty and get out in 3 weeks. Don't know about them. Do you have a suggestion, or do you have an objection to a temporary license of X number of days, or is the objection to it's not long enough to do the job?
I actually was making the reverse point.
Okay.
That the bulk of the camp season is shorter than 100 days.
Okay.
And so it's possible that one could have nurses practicing who never have a full license because they're licensed only through the temporary license for 100 days. They come and they go without ever having a fully active license.
I see.
But I've just seen this amendment this morning too, so there's more discussion I think that needs to be done about. I think temporary licenses can be a partial solution. The duration may need to be different than that. my opinion.
Follow-up. In a different direction, part of the amendment talks about nursing school graduates that have successfully taken their board examinations but are awaiting licensure. It would be it would be my understanding that as fresh graduates and having newly taken their boards, their knowledge base is just laden with best practices, up-to-date best practices, and some of the concern for people who may be coming back after a 3-year lapse would be having a knowledge gap in best practices. Am I catching that?
I think that you're correct that new grads would have current knowledge, limited experience
Yes.
in an independent role, sometimes in very rural areas, distant from other healthcare settings. There is a designation for a graduate nurse that I referenced earlier, and a graduate nurse requires supervision by a registered nurse. And so that would challenge a camp to have 2 people.
Got it. Thank you.
And I will defer to my my friends and colleagues who aren't able to be here today but can work on the language.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you for your time.
Next, we'll bring up Dave Cuzzy from the New Hampshire Society of Physicianal Assistants, who's wishing to speak and is also neutral. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is David Cuzzy. I'm here this morning on behalf of the New Hampshire Society of Physician Assistants, or NISPA, or just the PAs, you'll hear me refer to them as. Very simply, members of the committee, we're neutral on the bill. I suspect that the issue is just trying to find, for these summer camps, to try to find qualified folks to serve in these medical positions for these camps. We think that's great. We appreciate being included in the bill, at least in the beginning, but I'd also remind folks that physician assistants already have this authority under the PA statute, that's RSA 328 D16, and that also allows, in an effort to address I think the underlying concern here, that also allows PAs who are licensed out of state to be able to perform this function on a volunteer basis in New Hampshire. We want to make sure that, however this bill moves forward, that there is some sort of an exclusion that would not somehow unintentionally override the authority that's in 328 D16. So we respectfully suggest that. We do share some of the concerns that were raised by the nurses. I think, as I look at the amendment, while the letter I sent in said we'd just like to be included everywhere throughout the bill where nurses are mentioned, and I would respectfully suggest perhaps that could go for all medical professionals. We didn't think it would make sense to speak for others like nurse practitioners and whatnot, but at least the PAs, and knowing that it sounds like there'll be some work, we respectfully suggest we be included in that little working group, and it may end up making sense for us to be excluded entirely from whatever the final bill is, just based on how this may shake out. So I know our letter suggested we'd like to be included everywhere, but just hope that with your indulgence, perhaps we'd have the latitude to maybe not be included, if that makes the most sense, to achieve the goals and make sure that PAs aren't somehow adversely affected. I also note, too, just for the record, on the amendment that I just saw this morning, I noticed that there's on line 12 and 13 where it referenced physician assistants. It should be physician assistants, plural. The way that's written, it's as if we're assistants to physicians, and that's a very sensitive topic with PAs, which of course they're not. And then you see it again on line 13. I just wanted to make that note. So I appreciate the PAs being involved in any discussion going forward, and I thank you for hearing me this morning.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions for Mr. Cuzzy? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate you coming in. Next, we'll bring up Ken Robbins from the New Hampshire Camp Directors. Good morning.
Good morning, thank you. Should I start over? I apologize that I wasn't able to get this to you in advance. We just got our power back, so if it's okay, I'll just read what I have and I'll get a copy to you afterwards. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. To speak in support of Senate Bill 87, my name is Ken Robbins. I'm the Executive Director of Camp Kabian in Alton Bay. We're a 100-year-old residential camp for boys on Lake Winnipesaukee. Today, I'll be here on behalf of the New Hampshire Camp Directors Association, which is a membership organization representing the more than 160 licensed day and overnight youth recreation camps in the state of New Hampshire. These camps employ and serve hundreds of thousands of adults and children every year and contribute more than $150 million to the New Hampshire economy. Every summer camp that I have attended, worked for, visited, and heard of puts health and safety as their primary objective every summer, not only more important, but essential to meeting other goals of the camp experience, including learning and development, character building, skill building, and fun. As such, the need for professional medical staff on site at camps is not just a licensing requirement, though of course it is. The existing rules administered by the Department of Health and Human Services Child Care Licensing Unit requires residential and certain day camps to employ a healthcare practitioner, either a nurse, physician's assistant, or doctor, currently licensed in the state of New Hampshire. That person's required to be on site and available while camp is in session. For most camps, that means 24 hours per day, 7 days per week for an 8 to 10 week season. Over the past decade, and especially in the past few years, this has posed an increased challenge for camps in New Hampshire and across the country. Nurses are in short supply and extraordinary demand, not just in the camp industry. Convincing a nurse or doctor to work seasonally for organizations that cannot compete with the pay scale that hospitals and clinics offer is impractical for most. The emergency bills passed during the pandemic, expanding the pool of eligible healthcare practitioners to those awaiting licensure, those licensed in other states, and those holding an inactive but in good standing license, were a significant aid to camps. Establishing these expanded standards in a permanent way is an opportunity to give not only camps but tens of thousands of New Hampshire families who send their children to camp greater assurance that the health and safety needs of participants are comprehensively met. Speaking for my own camp, where I've served as director for the past 13 years and grew up at from the age of 11, until recently it was normal to have one nurse for the duration of the summer living on site year after year. Today, we're lucky to find a rotation of 3 to 4 different nurses every summer who are willing to take a few weeks, or in some cases a few days, to cover our health center. Some summers it requires many, many more. The familiarity that a full-time health care provider develops with the community that they serve increases safety and quality of care. The opportunities presented in this bill are a significant benefit to camps in New Hampshire, as well as to healthcare practitioners at the outset of their career, looking to gain valuable experience, and those with years of experience who are willing and interested in contributing their expertise as they step back from active year-round employment. Thank you to Senator Ward for bringing this bill forward, and to all New Hampshire legislators who've supported camps in our state to further their missions. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Any questions? Senator Carson.
Thank you very much for being here this morning, Mr. Robbins. One of the issues that have come up is the length of time for the temporary license. So would I be correct to say that camp season is from June 1st to September 1st?
It certainly depends on the camp. Every camp is a little bit different. Every camp season is a little bit different. I think it probably is accurate to say that the majority of camps operate in between June 1st and probably Labor Day, wherever that falls. But certainly there are camps that have programming that extends beyond that.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Okay, the only other one on my list is Henry Vayu, representing the New Hampshire Alliance of YMCAs, and they are in favor of the bill. Is anybody else that would like to speak? Seeing none, I will close the hearing on... Sorry about that, hit my button. Senate Bill 87. Yes. All right, next we will open up the hearing on Senate Bill 72 and welcome Senator Susi to introduce the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, I'm Donna Susi. I represent Senate District 18, comprised of the town of Litchfield and Manchester's wards 5 through 9. To start off, I just want to give you a little bit of context because it's actually a little unusual that this bill is before you. Typically, credentialing bills deal with licensure and the credentials of individuals to practice in their profession. This is actually an issue about insurance coverage and whether or not a provider is able to bill for coverage under someone's individual policy. So I just want to give you that context because it does appear to be a little bit different. So what this would do is make some minor changes to the provider credentialing verification procedures that are required for health carriers to follow when they credential healthcare professionals. It attempts to avoid delays for the patients that are seeking care when their provider is only making a minor change, whether it's a change of address or a change in practice ownership. Now, you will hear later in testimony that there was a concern at the end of line 5, beginning of line 6 about practice ownership. We can work certainly to refine that language. The concern was that when a change in practice ownership would put someone outside of the network. That's not what this intends to do. This would be a change in ownership but still remaining within the network. So I'm certainly open to working to refine that language. This would not change any of the requirements to notify the carriers. It just ensures that there isn't a disruption in their network participation status. And you can understand why, if there is a disruption, it may cause a problem for the patient seeking care from that particular provider. This would also allow the commissioner some authority to resolve these disputes that may occur from time to time between the carriers. And it's there for the effective resolution and quick resolution of any of these disputes that are brought to the commissioner's attention. That's essentially it in summary. You are going to hear from the Hospital Association, at whose behest I sponsored this legislation, and I know some of the carriers as well as the department are here. So although I'm happy to answer any questions, I think some of the more technical questions might be better suited for them.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions? Seeing none?
Thank you.
Well, then we'll call up Paula Minahan from the New Hampshire Hospital Association, who is in support.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Paula Minahan, Senior Vice President, State Government Relations for the New Hampshire Hospital Association, representing all our hospitals in New Hampshire. We are in strong support of Senate Bill 72, and we do appreciate Senator Susi sponsoring the bill, as well as all the co-sponsors with bipartisan support. This bill would amend the provider credentialing statute under RSA 420J4 just slightly, as Senator Susi identified. The intent of the bill is to ensure that patients do not experience unnecessary delays when the provider changes office location or practice ownership. Our hospital members have experienced delays in getting providers credentialed with the carriers in these particular circumstances. Again, no other credentialing requirements are impacted by this legislation, only the practice location or ownership. We are hopeful that the statute can more clearly state that in these circumstances, the changes can be reported to the carrier with little or no delay. And as Senator Susi also identified, there was a suggestion for the bill language to address the concerns that were raised relative to potential unintended consequences relative to creating an out-of-network provider scenario. That is not our intent, and we are happy to work with the committee members and the stakeholders to address that concern. I think that can really easily be amended. We could easily amend the bill to clarify that. And again, on behalf of our hospitals, we strongly urge you to support this bill, and we're happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll bring up Alex Feldfebel and DJ Betancourt from the New Hampshire Insurance Department. They've not taken a position, but they want to provide information. Sorry about butchering your name. Absolutely. Welcome to EDNA. Turn on your mic, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is DJ Betancourt, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Deputy Commissioner of the New Hampshire Insurance Department. I am joined this morning by Alex Feldfebel. For those of you who have followed the history of the Insurance Department, you know you're getting 2 Deputy Commissioners this morning for the price of 1. I serve in the position currently. Alex served in the position just prior to my coming on board. He retired. Fortunately, he got restless. And so now we have him in a different position to be a great asset to the department. I wanted to just start off this morning by reiterating the department's commitment to enforcing the state's credentialing statute. We understand how important that statute is to providers and to ensure that they are able to provide the care to patients that they have committed their life's work to doing. We did understand in some conversations with the Hospital Association over the course of the last 2 years that they were encountering some issues. And so as a result of that, Commissioner Nicolopoulos in April of 2001 issued a bulletin to the industry, making it very clear the department's position that the statute as it pertains to credentialing must be followed. As a result of that, our consumer division has seen a notable decrease in the number of credentialing-related complaints coming into the department. They came down. Those complaints decreased. In addition to that, as a result of the bulletin, the department has engaged in 2 investigations, my understanding is, again, post-bulletin. Those investigations are ongoing. But obviously, we are committed to helping to improve the process as best as we can. But I think as you've heard from both the sponsor of the bill, Senator Soucy, and the Hospital Association, we want to make sure that we are guarding against unintended consequences. I think that if we're talking about demographic changes, that is completely reasonable. If you've got a provider that got married and they're going from Dr. Smith to Dr. Jones, it makes complete sense that that would not trigger a credentialing process. But we do want to make sure that as we get into some of these other circumstances, we don't do anything that will undermine consumer protection. And to that point, my colleague, Alex, has an amendment that we think will ensure against those unintended consequences. Alex.
Thank you. We're, to be more specific about what the insurance department is concerned is, we're concerned with 2 sections of the bill, starting with section 2, which is, the latter part of the bill. We're concerned with the wording of that section in terms of talking about settling disputes about credentialing. Instead of setting up the commissioner as a neutral arbiter to hear disputes and be kind of a judge or adjudicator, our model is that we receive complaints and then we investigate. And if we find something, we might even declare an examination. And then, so we're more of a prosecutor. So we would prefer the language which I can hand out at the end of my testimony that would be more consistent with our usual regulatory approach and that commits the commissioner to receiving complaints from providers and following up on the credentialing complaints that they have. Our second concern is with the first section of the bill, which addresses whether re-credentialing is triggered by a move or a change in name or ownership, that is. And we wanted to point out that there's a drafting challenge here because there's a different section of this same credentialing statute that reads as follows. When a healthcare provider relocates or opens an additional office and the carrier requires a site visit, documentation of the new site visit shall be required as part of the credentialing process. So that wasn't amended, it's still in the statute, so there's a conflict that we need to address. And overall, I would just want to express that we understand the issue here. The credentialing statute was first put in place as a part of regulating managed care and putting on the carriers a bunch of requirements to do their due diligence about making sure that providers are credentialed and competent to perform their services. More recently, there have been a lot of issues around the clunkiness of the credentialing process and how much time it takes. And the department has been working on that to find ways to expedite the process, particularly for areas where there are shortage of providers like mental health or primary care. So we're very committed to the issue, and we would be happy to participate in redrafting the language to achieve the purposes that are intended.
All right. Thank you for your testimony. Senator Carson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, gentlemen. I have a few questions. I hope that the chair will indulge me. I want to make sure, first of all, are we talking about the credentialing of a business versus the credentialing of an individual?
Both.
Okay. May I follow up?
Keep going.
So if, I mean, I'm not going to, I don't know enough about the credentialing, quite frankly, of a business. But if you're talking about an individual, be it a doctor, a nurse, physical therapist, any of those folks, they're all licensed by the state of New Hampshire. Do you think that if a complaint has been made against an individual that they're not properly credentialed, that complaint should go to OPLC and the appropriate board as opposed to the insurance department?
I think we're pretty sure it should stay the way it is, which is it should come to the insurance department because we're the ones with regulatory authority over the health carrier, who is the source of the credentialing problem. If there's a holdup, usually the job of the health carrier is to verify the licensure status of the individual provider as a part of the credentialing process. So they're like two different things.
Okay, so to get back to my original question was the business versus the individual. You're not really concerned too much with the credentialing of the individual. It is within the purview of the business which is being credentialed to make sure that their workers or people that they're covering and having insurance coverage for are properly credentialed. So you're not necessarily looking at the individual, what you're looking at is the business itself or the carrier, and making sure they're properly credentialed, correct?
I think some of the carriers that are behind me could speak in more depth about how they treat what we can call a facility or a group practice, where they're, maybe looking at credentialing a hospital or an urgent care center or something like that. And there are a whole number of providers practicing within that facility, as to what extent they're mostly focusing their credentialing attention on the facility or also looking through at the licensure status of all the individual employees.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you. You make a great team, so come back and see us again. Okay, we'll move into the opposed category. Sabrina Dunlop from Anthem is opposed and wishing to speak. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi, everyone. I'm Sabrina Dunlap. I'm Director of Government Relations at Anthem. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. So I just wanted to touch quickly on sort of the overall picture of credentialing and how it fits into the contracting process. Sorry, let me get my notes. So when we contract with a provider, that'll be a contract between the provider and the carrier for services rendered. That's part of the process. And then sort of after that is the credentialing process. And so that includes sort of additional background related to education, licensing, specialty. And as the department mentioned, it's a way that for carriers to verify that a provider's qualified to do what they want to do. And obviously this is governed by state statute. So one distinction I want to make is that demographic changes are sort of a distinct and separate process. So we have credentialing over here. And then if a provider needs to make a demographic update, if it's an address change or a name change, they can, I think most carriers have a portal. I know Anthem, there's a portal you can go on to. You can make simple changes. You can also make changes that might impact your network status, like a change in ownership. So you can actually change your tax ID through that portal. And so one of my concerns with the bill is that it's sort of taking demographic updates and putting them in the credentialing statute. And I don't think that that belongs there. They are distinct issues. And I think, you know, the other big concern is that the way the language reads now is that it would interfere with providers potentially being moved or in or out of network appropriately based on certain demographic changes, because sometimes you can make a demographic change that does appropriately result in you as a provider potentially being moved in or out of network. So I know that issue was flagged earlier. That is a concern of ours. So hopefully that's clear. But I guess I'm a little unclear on what the bill's trying to do, and I think it sort of interferes with the correct process as it stands today. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Senator Perkins Walker.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Ms. Dunlap. So can you just give those of us that don't know anything about this, like, what's an example of how a location could make a provider fall out of network?
How a what could make a change?
How a change in location or ownership? What's an example?
So if you were an independent provider and you were in our network, and then you are purchased by a hospital system that's out of network, it's possible you could go in to make a demographic change, change your address, change your tax ID. You're now part of that hospital network, which is potentially out of network. But I think the way this bill reads is we would not be allowed to appropriately move that provider out of network now that they're part of the hospital system. So that's just one example. And I know it was stated that was not the intent, but my concern is that's the way it reads.
Okay, and just one follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So would it meet your purposes, for example, if this read something more like shall maintain credentialed status pending review by the provider about whether the new provider is out of network? Like, I'm just trying to figure out if there's
I think that we could definitely look at different language. I think it's the network piece that is a big flag for me. And so there are times when I just want to make sure I have my examples right, because this does get confusing. So yes, so there can be examples where a provider who was not previously credentialed as an individual makes a demographic change, and as a result, they do now need to be credentialed as an individual. But I do think sticking with language that's tied to credentialing would make me less nervous about this having unintended consequences.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Dunn.
Any further questions? I know my head's spinning trying to understand all this. This is not an area.
I know it is. It can be confusing. So
Not an area I had any knowledge in of at all. So,
all right. Well, thank you for the
all
opportunity
right. Well,
to speak.
thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have Heidi Kroll from America's Health Insurance Plans, who is opposed to the bill. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Heidi Kroll. I work at Gallagher, Callahan, and Gartrell, and I'm here today representing AHIP, which is America's Health Insurance Plans. We're the trade association for the health insurance carriers. I will try not to repeat what others have said, both from the department and Sabrina Dunlap from Anthem. We are concerned about the bill. We are opposed to it as it is currently drafted. And I think it's important to keep in mind that, as you've heard, a change in provider demographics can trigger either, can have ripple effects either with the contract and because the tax ID is linked to the contract. So, and it may not even be from like an in-network to out-of-network. It could also just be, from one in-network contract to another in-network contract where those contract terms and conditions are different. So there's that to keep in mind. And I know that, this says any changes in provider demographics to include practice location or practice ownership, but I assume that it's like including but not limited to. And the only other thing I wanted to say is that even other types of changes in demographics could trigger a carrier to take a closer look at the credentials again of a provider. If a provider has switched practices, for example, 3 times in a year, that might make a carrier take a closer look and think, is this provider like running from something? Is there something going on here? Is there fraud? Is there drug diversion? Is there some other issue, which may require, and rightly so. I don't know if you have a complete copy of the credentialing statute, but I do have copies for you if that's helpful. I'm happy to hand those in. But anyway, you'll see there that there's a very long list of a right and an obligation of the carrier to make sure that providers and facilities that are in the network are have the right credentials, and part of that is that patients and consumers, members of carriers, rely on, if somebody is in network, that's kind of a stamp of approval from the carrier that this provider has kind of passed some tests and some thresholds and is really qualified to be in the network. So we're happy to work with folks if legislation is really the answer. It may be that it's not. Maybe there's a non-legislative solution here. As you did hear, the department is on top of this. They've issued bulletins. They do, they handle complaints. They do investigations. So it may be that a non-legislative solution could also work. I don't want to speak for others, but we're open to that as well. So I'm happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony.
Yep.
Any questions? Senator Perkins Quokka.
Yeah, again, and I think it sounds like, there's some working out to do, so I don't want to get too in the weeds, but it does seem like the intent here is just to make sure that at the end of the day, the patients are essentially receiving uninterrupted service. So there's a good intent here, and I guess I'm just failing to understand how an investigation by the department per se assists at the time that a practice is transitioning credentials. That doesn't necessarily move the timeline along for our patients. So maybe you can just help me understand how those pieces fit together.
Well, I did want to, I'm glad you brought that up because I did want to mention, if for some reason a provider's change in demographics causes their contract to cancel, we have laws on the books. There are 2 laws, in fact. One is in RSA 420J8, which is the Provider Contract Standards Law. And under that, Roman 11, there's a requirement that every contract entered into after July 1st of 2023 between a health carrier and any physician or facility shall contain a provision that ensures that covered persons will have continued access to the provider in the event that a contract is terminated for any reason other than unprofessional behavior. And the continued access to providers shall be made available for 60 days from the date of termination. There's also another provision in 420J:7D, which allows the commissioner to extend that by an additional 60 days. So it is possible that patients, if any of this triggered a contract cancellation, patients are protected for a minimum of 60 days and possibly up to 120 days by law.
Could you give me those RSAs again?
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Thank
absolutely,
you.
yes. The first RSA that I quoted is 420-J:8. That's the provider contract standards, and it's Roman 11 there. And then the other one that I mentioned, which gives the commissioner the authority to extend the original 60 days by an additional 60 days, that is in RSA 420-J:7-d.
Thank you. Sorry,
Thank you.
a little slow writing there. Any further questions? Seeing none. Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
very much.
testimony. And finally, we have Peter Bragdon from Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, who is opposed to the bill, wishing to speak. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Peter Bragdon. I'm a recovering state senator. I'm also a senior policy advisor with Preddy Strategies here on behalf of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, a not-for-profit health insurance company founded by doctors, and here today in opposition to Senate Bill 72. For a number of reasons, and I guess first and foremost, it seems that the bill is probably not necessary. We've had testimony already from the Department of Insurance that they receive complaints about this, they deal with it. There's provisions in place to protect the patients, to make sure they still get the coverage, as was just discussed by Heidi Kroll. The bill seems to be addressing an anecdotal issue, and unfortunately, we aren't told what the anecdotal issue is, so we're kind of speculating on what kind of things could be causing this. The department mentioned there were only 2 cases, I think, that they were reviewing. So it can't be too often, and unfortunately, it's without knowing what the actual circumstances are that might have developed this legislation, it's hard to say what is actually going on. And it seems to be one of those issues that can be resolved by talking with each other rather than passing a law. When I first entered the House in the early 2000s, there was a rep from, I think, Grafton County, Doug Teschner, who went off to work in Africa for election reforms and election viability, and now he's back, and I think he did a course for legislators on compromising and dealing with difficult situations. And he did part of the orientation when I was a freshman state rep, and he said, you know, people see something and say there ought to be a law. And he said, you know, not always, it doesn't need to be a law, and I think this might be one of those cases. So let me see, I crossed off a number of things I was going to say because people have already said them, so I'll just jump to this. I'll give an example of an issue where some change in, quote, demographics could cause a potential issue that has to be addressed that's not the insurance company's fault. Let's say we have a primary care physician, a PCP, is working with medical practice A in one town, and decides they're going to move to medical practice B in another town some distance away, let's say. We, as the carrier, we need notification and confirmation both from practice A, where they are now, and practice B, where they're leaving. For a couple of reasons. One, to prevent mischief. We want to make sure this is indeed happening. But 2, we need more information, more instructions on what to do with that, what's called the patient panel. All the patients that are with that PCP, what happens to them? That's something that it's not a unilateral decision. It's something that has to be resolved. And so sometimes, unfortunately, it takes time to do that. It could be there is a non-amicable breakup of that relation. It's almost like a divorce, I guess, right? And what do you do with the kids? We need participation from both practices in order to make the proper decisions about what happens with all the patients. And if those 2 aren't cooperating, it ties our hands. We can allow the provider to be credentialed with the new practice, but not as a PCP, because you can only be a PCP with one practice. So we can allow them in, we can allow them to see patients, but they can't be a PCP until basically the original practice group notifies us and says, yes, this is okay, and here's what's happening with these patients. Most of the patients probably want to stay with the practice group if it's a distance, but some may want to stay with the provider. But we can't just make those decisions in the dark. And so there have been cases where those things drag on, not because we're dragging our feet. We're required by federal law to have and maintain an accurate, up-to-date directory. In fact, we have 2 business days from the time we're notified to update that directory. And if it's reported to us by somebody that information in the directory is not accurate, we have 30 days to resolve it. If we can't resolve it by federal law, we have to remove that provider from our directory. So we're operating in a very stringent regulatory environment. It's in our interest, it's the patient's interest to have accurate and up-to-date information. But sometimes there's things out of our control. And so I was going to say, in my opinion, a bill is not necessary. I think that things are in place to resolve the few issues that come up. But if you're going to change the law, then maybe put something in there that says all the provider and practice groups involved in the transaction have to participate, because sometimes our hands are tied. So I really think this is more of a solution in search of a problem. I'd urge you folks to find the bill inexpedient to legislate and tell the parties to find a non-legislative solution, also known as talking with each other. Happy to answer any questions, Mr.
Senator Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Senator. Thank you for your testimony. I'm looking at the second paragraph of the bill, which really gives the department the ability to establish rules as opposed to statute to deal with this, to resolve any dispute. Do you think that this might be a solution, rather to go through the rulemaking process where you're going to get everyone at the table and have all the public hearings and everything, rather than statute?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And I think if there is a dispute, certainly it's up to you folks as a policy committee to determine whether what role you feel the commissioner should have, whether it's making a decision or doing an investigation. I think our biggest concern is the Section 1 of the bill and the added language that actually I think causes more trouble. But if there's a dispute, I think we're ambivalent in terms of whether it's handled in the current method or whether there's actual powers given to the department.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Perkins Quokka.
Yes, I just, I had two questions. One is, I think you've made your position clear, but just as an alternative, how would you feel about the language that essentially read, the provider would maintain credentials pending, sort of carrier diligence or some similar?
So my understanding is, and I've been representing Harvard Pilgrim for 3 or 4 years, and my head still spins from time to time, referencing your prior discussion. So I don't know all the details of how it works, but my understanding is that if the provider leaves one practice group to another, they're still considered within the insurance plans as part of the original group until such time as they're released. So I think if you were to make it so that they're considered provider under the second group, that's problematic. If they stay a provider with the first group, that's already something that's current practice, so I don't know that a law is necessary to affect that.
Okay, that's helpful. And then one more question, if I
Follow
may.
up? Sure.
Yeah. And again, this is just to help understand. You made reference to sort of making decisions about what happens with the patients, but ultimately the patients are just deciding where their care goes, right? Whether to stay with the
Correct.
practice or go with the provider. Okay.
So, and thank you for the question. I mean, there's a process involved usually where the original practice group will probably reach out to the patient and say, what would you prefer to do? And that takes some time too. And so again, these are anecdotal stories. We're not really sure what the issue is, but if we're told about this change before the original practice group has even had a chance to notify the patients that this is coming up, then it just ties the hand. That's why this seems like a one-size-fits-all, and I think it's more complex than that.
Complicated. Okay. Thank you.
Senator Altshuler. Oh, all right. Any further questions? Well, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senators.
Appreciate it. All right, that is all the folks that I have on the list. Anybody else wishing to speak? Seeing none, we're going to close the hearing on Senate Bill 72. All right, next we'll open up the hearing on Senate Bill 74, and I recognize Senator Carson to introduce. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, fellow committee members. For the record, my name is Sharon Carson, and I have the pleasure of representing Senate District 14, comprising the towns of Londonderry, Hudson, and Auburn. And I have for your consideration this morning Senate Bill 74, relative to the Department of Administrative Services. This bill makes several changes to statutes related to the Department of Administrative Services. It repeals 7 statutes relative to Department Administrative Services, an exception, Department of Transportation, temporary, seasonal, and part-time employees, and positions made permanent, retroactive accumulation, application of statute, adjustment of salaries of classified state employees, salary increases for nurses, and overtime for nurses at certain institutions. And finally, I will conclude by saying this bill is a request of the Department of Administrative Services, and there are folks here that will be able to walk you through this bill. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions? Seeing none? Oh, gentlemen? Oh, okay, sorry. All right, next we'll call up Charlie Arlinghouse from the Division of Administrative Services, who I know has the answers to all things wrong with the world.
That's a big ask. I'm going to bring with me, if you don't mind, the Director and Deputy Director of the Division of Personnel. But before I do that, I'm going to give you a handout, one for everybody, so everybody can follow along. Hi, I'm Charlie Arlinghouse. I'm the Commissioner of Administrative Services, and with me are Matt Mavrogeorge, the Deputy Commissioner, Deputy, what are you exactly? Deputy Director of Personnel, and Lori Rudis, who is the Director of Personnel.
Well, I thank you for introducing, because I was reading that name going, I don't know if I can get that one.
Well, we... Yes, exactly. We do what we can. I'm hopeful this is the most boring part of your day at this moment, and I pride myself on that being what we do, all the boring stuff. Senator Carson agreed to sponsor this bill as a favor to us, and so I hope that if you don't like something, you'll hold it against me, not her. I've given you written testimony which explains the 22 sections that the bill has, and one of the things you'll note, I'm not going to walk through them all because you'll all fall asleep, but most of them will strike you as almost petty. Right, we change salary to pay in 2 different places, for example. So the lion's share of the bill is cleanup in a couple of ways. One is that statutorily we clean things up when we make changes, and the things persist because that's how somebody wrote it in 1986. And so we're cleaning up language to use language that is commonly used, language that is technically accurate, as opposed to whenever somebody wrote a bill in 1986, let's say. And so we make some of those changes. In addition to that, the department for the last 2 years has been working on updates, renovating, if you will, the classification system. Classification system is a system established in roughly 1950. It's a predecessor, but let's call it 1950, by which we classify and allocate and assign every position in state government to a normed position and put them in a giant grid. That system hasn't changed dramatically since 1950, and we're changing it in cooperation with stakeholders groups, commissioners groups, and union groups to get to a good place. And we use language, we change language so it reflects what we're doing. We, for a couple of examples, we currently talk about class series because that's the way positions are allocated. There's an SJD, which is part of a class spec, which is in a class series. And that's how these things typically work. We use occupational group, which is a more generic term and a more standard term. That's almost every change in the bill. I want to refer you, though, to one change, which is section 16, which is the major substantive change in the bill. And it will give the DOP director to allow for an equitable enhancement of steps within a position. I'm going to try to explain this in a fairly simple way. Let's say that you've got a group of positions, a class of positions. I'm going to use, let's say, liquor store retail clerks as an example. And because of the economy, you start hiring everybody at not step 1, but step 4 or 5, let's say. And so every new employee gets hired at step 5. And because in fact, this is actually happening now in a lot of cases where you can't hire anybody at step 1 in the state system because of the way the market is. They can do better at Dunkin' Donuts, and they get free donuts. So we do that, and there's a handful of positions who are sitting there going, hey, I'm step 2 because I took the job a few years ago. You're hiring everybody else as sort of a de facto. Everybody's step 5. What about me? And the point of a classification system is equity. Similarly situated people are treated equitably. There is currently a workaround for this, which is ridiculous and it's not dishonest, but it's a little bit, well, it's a workaround. You have an open position. You can take somebody who's in a current position and have them apply for the same job. And you're still a retail clerk too, but why don't you apply for the open one and we'll put you at step 5. It's silly. It's fair, but it's silly. And so what this change would allow is in certain circumstances, according to standards that they develop, we would allow essentially departments to petition and then the director of personnel to make a decision based on equity. Obviously not every decision. Sometimes people get hired differently. You hire somebody with 25 years of experience who's leaving a software company and he or she comes in at step 7 and somebody there is step 3 and it's just the way it is. But in situations where there's this sort of broad inequity, there'd be a way of addressing it that is open rather than sneaky. Other than that, that's what this does. I do think it's a cleanup bill. I think that is the only thing substantive in the bill. The rest of it is cleaning up language and making everything more modern, for lack of a better word. But if anybody has any questions, I have smart people here with me.
Well, thank you. Sounds like you're doing what all of us in the private sector are having to do, which is adjust and be nimble with our practices to keep up with the pay demands and the increases. You didn't want to continue on with the World War II references and World War I references?
I think there was a thought that those might be modernized.
Well, thank you. Matt, Lori, anything you want to add at this point, or just questions from the committee?
No, I'd just like to thank Senator Carson for supporting the bill. And as Charlie said, we just need to do a lot of cleanup. And as we need to look back at our laws and kind of say, okay, it's time to clean these up because we have old references that don't make any sense anymore.
Sure.
So I appreciate the committee looking this over.
Any questions from the committee? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Senator Gendro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the three of you, for being here to testify. Just in my mind, so I have clarification, we have the most wonderful aides and staffers here at the State House. There are some that have been here for a long time and have hit that final step. Will this take care of that, or will it help them as far as upping, and I'm probably not using the right words, but...
No, but I know exactly what you mean. Unfortunately, no. Two reasons. One is that legislative staff are not covered by the classification system. The legislature has its own system, which is wonderful for legislative employees because they do much better than they would if they worked for the executive branch financially. We can't pay our accountants anywhere near what you pay your accountants legally. In any step system, if you think of it as a giant spreadsheet, there are 35 horizontal lines, which is the labor grade in the classification system. And there are 9 steps, which are essentially based on longevity. Once you hit 9, you're at 9 in that position. Could you get promoted? Yes, you could get promoted. But once you hit 9, there just isn't a 10. It's just, think of it as functionally, this is what the job pays. And if you stay another 20 years, well, it is still what that job pays. You're not going to keep going up. So at some point you do bump into an end, and it's just the way any sort of a grid happens to work. And so it's hard, right? Because you know this is somebody who's bringing enormous value to the organization because of their experience. But unfortunately, at some point there is a wall.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Altshuler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. Is this work? Can you hear me? So I'm looking at what appears to me to be another substantive change on page 5. The elimination of the second half of lines 9 through 12. So an individual working on a part-time basis shall not be eligible to utilize either sick or annual leave. But, and this is the part eliminated, at each anniversary of employment, should the total working time during the preceding year amount to the equivalent of 6 months or more, he or she shall be paid all accumulated annual leave, not in excess of that which may be allowed in rules adopted by the Division of Personnel. So we do have a lot of seasonal workers, and particularly in the past year or so, being short-staffed on the mountain and at the parks. Those employees have worked a significant amount of hours beyond what, some of them wanted to, because we just didn't have the people and they were as invested. Why would there be an elimination of this benefit?
I know it's not our intention to eliminate a benefit. Matt, are you familiar with the details of that specific provision?
Yes, I think the thought behind it was we have the definitions of permanent employees that define someone who's, made it past the probationary period, which is 12 months. And then we have this other language that kind of floats out there in various statutes talking about this 6-month equivalency. So our thought was to try to get rid of the 6-month equivalency wherever we found it, not necessarily to eliminate a benefit, but the benefits really, for the most part, are being brought up and dealt with in the collective bargaining agreements. So we thought that there was a better place for those types of provisions to live.
Are you saying that people who work at Cannon Mountain are engaged in collective bargaining?
No, what we're saying is
those are part-time,
sure, there
seasonal people.
Sure, yes. There are provisions in the CBAs that do deal with part-time employees specifically. And so what we were trying to do is just clean up the 6-month language because of the complications with the definitions.
What I'll do, if it will, because nothing we're doing here is meant to eliminate any leave for anyone in any circumstance, and I want to specify that. So why don't I do this? I'll go back with the language and clarify that it doesn't affect anybody's leave in any way, and then get you an explanation of that and why that is. And if there's any question about it impacting anyone's leave in any way, we would then come forward and ask you to remove that from the bill itself. So I'll take care of that, but it's our understanding is this does not affect anyone's leave. But let me clarify that for you and get clarifying language.
Thanks.
Senator Carson, did you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Commissioner and staff. In regards to part-time employees, it's my understanding that a lot of our part-time and seasonal employees are former state employees. And you've got the nexus of the retirement system where they're only allowed to work so many hours a week and they're not eligible for sick leave or any of these other provisions that a full-time permanent employee would have access to. So I guess I'm just saying that for informational purposes. For whatever reason, just so everyone knows that you do have this issue of the retirement system sitting on top of seasonal and part-time employees. And perhaps what needs to happen is there should be a distinction made between those who are retired state employees versus someone who is just hired for the season who is not a state employee, a former state employee.
No, it's a good point. Let me clarify that and get that answer. I know, again, our attempt is not to affect anything substantively.
Any further questions? Seeing none, we thank you. Very enlightening.
Thanks for having us.
It wasn't near as much of a complicated bill as it looked like when I was reading it. So we appreciate that. All right, that's all I have on the sheet. Anyone else wishing to speak on Senate Bill 74? Seeing none, I'm going to close the hearing. Next, we will move to Senate Bill 75. I will again call on Senator Carson to introduce the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, good morning. For the record, my name is Sharon Carson. I have the pleasure of representing Senate District 14, comprising the towns of Londonderry, Hudson, and Auburn. And for your consideration this morning, I have Senate Bill 75, relative to the Division of Personnel in the Department of Administrative Services. This bill creates a new chapter for the Personnel Appeal Board. It also repeals 6 statutes related to the Department of Administrative Services Division. And finally, this bill is a request from the Department of Administrative Services. As you know, they're here this morning, so they will be able to answer your questions much better than I can. So again, I thank you very much for your time this morning.
Any questions? Seeing none? We'll call on our power team again from Administrative Services with Charlie Arlinghouse and Matt and Lori, and I'm going to, if you all want to come up together again, or Charlie, you want to handle this on your own? Okay.
This will be fast.
All right.
So this is a request of the Personnel Appeals Board, and Personnel Appeals Board is sort of part of the department, and it isn't part of the department, and it's one of those sort of weird things. It's an adjudicative board to whom appeals go to. And people who've been around long enough will remember that in the 80s, there was actually in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a Personnel Commission, which included a board and a director. And in 86, it was folded into the newly created Department of Administrative Services and separated. And the commission itself became the Division of Personnel. And the board, what used to be their board of directors, which was an appellate body with executive authority too, persisted as the Personnel Appeals Board, which is where there's a grievance process and there's a step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then you can appeal to the board. So it's a board that hears appeals on things. They're so obviously they're separate from us, but sort of within us. They have their own accounting unit, and there's this sort of weird relationship. So all this really does is it takes their statutes and it moves them out of the Administrative Services statutes into their own. So if you think of another board like the Public Employee Relations Board or something like that, and it clarifies that, you know, you're not the boss of us and we're not the boss of you. And that's what it's meant to do. I don't think I would want to consult with Jason. My understanding is the board itself is meeting right now, which is why the chairman of that board is not here. But that these are changes that they've requested and are supportive of. And my understanding is that they don't really change anything about the compensation of the board, the structure of the board, the things that go to the board, et cetera. But it moves it into its own statute and clarifies that the Personnel Appeals Board is an independent body, not part of one of the departments of state government. In fact, the department that most often is on one side of an appeal to it. If you think about it, it's actually kind of weird, right? That typically before that board, there are 2 groups of people. You know, one is you know one is typically an employee and is often represented by the union, not always, but often, and the other is typically management, and it often includes you know, some personnel action or HR action. And so we're always before the board. It's very hard for us to, like, you know, you can't like threaten their rent unless they rule your way or something like that.
Well, thank you. I can understand where that appearance of conflict is there. So we did receive a request from the Personnel Appeals Board to sort of, because they're not able to be here and testify today, they did provide, I don't know if all of you received the email from them or not. I do have an email from them that they're providing. As I read it, it appears to be support for this. You know, they have concerns that they're raising, obviously, that I think you've articulated fairly well from my reading of their email.
It's, well, like I say, it's, you know, I would listen to their concerns because it's their, and it's their bill rather than our bill.
Okay.
I mean, I probably, you know, will want to know what they are at some point.
My thought
it's a
on
bill
this
we're
was-
going to track, let me put it that way.
Sure. My thought on this was perhaps to recess this hearing and give them an opportunity and take it up again next week so that they could come in and hear that. And you wouldn't have any objection to that?
None at all.
No, okay. Would the rest of the committee have any objection to that? Because I think it would be a good opportunity to let them come in and speak. Okay, thank you. Well, with that, we're going to recess the hearing on Senate Bill 75, and we'll put it on our docket for the next time we meet, which I believe will be next Wednesday. And our final bill hearing for today is Senate Bill 71 FM. And I again will recognize Senator Carson.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate having the opportunity to do my bills together all at once. It's easier for me, and it's also easier for the committee. So for the record, my name is Sharon Carson. I represent Senate District 14, comprising the towns of Londonderry, Hudson, and Auburn. And I have for your consideration this morning Senate Bill 71, which seeks to do two things. First, to establish a commission to study workers' compensation for firefighter cancer disease. And secondly, it allows for worker compensation for firefighter cancer for all types of cancer. Mr. Chairman, in the past few years, this body, the Senate as well as the House, has passed legislation dealing with firefighter cancer. And as more medical studies are being done, we're finding out that because of the types of chemicals that firefighters have been exposed to during the course of their career, they are being subjected to more types of cancer. So if you look at the bill on page 1 and see that lines 5 through 8 have been struck, in the past, what we did was we tied it to the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And this bill proposes to change that and just make the assumption that any type of cancer is caused by the occupation. And I do think it's an extremely important issue for the legislature to take up. Again, we're getting more information as time goes on about the types of chemicals that our firefighters have been exposed to. So I think at this point I'm going to stop my testimony. There are folks here that have been working on this for a very long time and have worked with the legislature to get what we currently have in statute. And so hopefully you can leave your questions for them. So at this point, I will conclude my testimony, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions? All right, seeing none. Next, we'll bring up Brian, and I'm sorry, Brian, I can't read you. Rill? Yes. All right, thank you. Brian Rill from the Professional Firefighters Association, who is in favor and wishes to speak. Thank you for the clarification. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Senator Carson, thank you for the introduction of this bill and your consistent support for firefighter health and safety. It means more than you know to us. So my name is Brian Rill, and I serve as the president of the Professional Firefighters of New Hampshire. I'm also a captain at the City of Portsmouth Fire Department. The Professional Firefighters of New Hampshire represents approximately 2,000 active and retired professional firefighters and paramedics across the Granite State. As a preeminent firefighter organization in New Hampshire, we advocate for the health and safety of our members and the brave men and women that protect our citizens. I have also submitted written testimony this morning, which you may have in front of you, so I'll try and keep my remarks brief. Firefighter occupational cancer is the leading cause of line-of-duty deaths in the fire service. In 2019, more than 75% of the names that we added to the International Association of Firefighters, Fallen Firefighters Memorial, were members who had died from occupational cancer. It's no secret that firefighting is an inherently dangerous profession. We lay our lives on the line day in and day out to protect the lives and property of complete strangers. Oftentimes, we are rewarded with a cancer diagnosis for our efforts. In 2018, New Hampshire took a huge step, and it began here in this committee, in advocating for and protecting firefighters by passing Senate Bill 541. Senate Bill 541 provided presumptive cancer coverage for occupational cancer for firefighters. This legislation laid the foundation for comprehensive cancer coverage for firefighters in New Hampshire, and Senate Bill 71 is an attempt to build on this foundation. If passed, Senate Bill 71 would expand presumptive cancer coverage to be inclusive of all cancers. Current law states that occupational cancer must be a type which may be caused by exposure to heat, radiation, or a known carcinogen, as defined by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, as Senator Carson mentioned. This means that current law excludes an extensive list of cancers that firefighters are at increased risk for, and I'd like to read you a few of those now. Brain cancer, stomach cancer, mouth cancer, testicular cancer, malignant melanoma, colon cancer, Hodgkin's lymphoma, female reproductive cancers, and many more. The truth is that there is evidence to support the claim that firefighters are at an increased risk for most cancers, yet our current law is not representative of that. In fact, recent years have shown that firefighter personal protective equipment, our gear that we wear to keep us safe and protected from the harmful nature of heat and smoke, fire, in fact, carries PFAS in all 3 layers of our gear. That means the personal protective equipment that we are wearing to protect the citizens of this state is actually giving our members cancer. In addition, Senate Bill 71 would establish a committee to study the implementation of cancer screenings for firefighters. The American Cancer Society cites routine cancer screenings as being of utmost importance for early detection and mitigation of cancer. A routine cancer screening program would promote early detection and potentially life-saving intervention for firefighters and reduce long-term costs for employers and insurance risk pool providers. Similar programs are currently in existence in other states and have been well received from all stakeholders. This legislation is progressive in its intent and paramount to the protection of firefighters across the Granite State. I would respectfully ask this committee for its full support and request that you vote to pass Senate Bill 71. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Brian. There may be a second page to your testimony that we didn't get because we kind of stopped about halfway through. So,
on the written, we'll make sure you get that.
Yeah, if you could, because there was some great information there in the second
Yep.
half that we didn't have in your testimony.
We'll send that right now.
Any questions from the committee? Senator General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for taking or giving us your testimony. I got a question for you. If the PFAS is causing that so much cancer, should we do a committee to come up with some different gear, or to come up with? I mean, I feel bad that we're, there's firefighters, and we all highly respect what they're doing, and they're saving lives. But if they're going into these situations wearing that, knowing that it's causing cancer, should we get to the root cause and do something different as far as the uniforms?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I'm going to start by saying I would never say no to that. But I would tell you that this is something that is now at the federal level as well. A bill was recently passed this year to have, by the end of 2023, to have some sort of fixes in place for this. It is now the International Association of Firefighters has made this their #1 health and safety issue to determine how best to force manufacturers to manufacture gear that no longer has these harmful chemicals in it. And as I mentioned, federal legislation was signed by the president this year to get that done. So certainly, while I'm supportive of doing the same at the state level, just be aware that that is going on. Additionally, New Hampshire took a huge step, and don't quote me on the date, I believe it was 2019, may have been earlier, to require manufacturers for personal protective equipment to notify the employer and the employee via a letter in their personnel file that this personal protective equipment does in fact contain PFAS chemicals in it.
Senator Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to add on to Senator Gendro's questions. And I noticed on page 2, beginning on line 12 and 13, which begins a new section, it gives the commission the ability to study anything that it deems relevant. And section 4 says that they may solicit input from any person or entity the commission deems relevant. So I think that this commission will be able to address the concerns that Senator Gendro has raised.
I would agree. Thank you, Senator, for that. Yeah, the intent behind the commission would be to throw a broad net over this issue and determine how best to move forward for all preventative measures. And certainly we would be happy to see that be a part of the commission. So.
Follow up?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rill, you've referenced legislation that we passed, I believe in 2019, that requires manufacturers to notify firefighters if there were toxic chemicals that were used to produce the equipment that they wear. Is this where you got the information that suits firefighter equipment contains PFAS?
Yes and no. So we actually, this was something that the International Association of Firefighters had determined prior to that, and as somewhat of a measure to help with presumptive workers' compensation coverage, we wanted those letters from our manufacturers in our file as an admission that yes, these do in fact contain it. This wasn't something that originated in New Hampshire. It was certainly at the national level first. And New Hampshire, I would say, is, don't quote me on it, but I believe one of the first states that actually added this component into personnel files.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Oh, Senator Gendro, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. One question that I have, you had mentioned that all cancers would be remediated or covered or whatever. I'm just thinking about an incident back many, many years ago in my district where the fire chief actually chewed, I don't know what it's called, skull or something, and it was determined that he had cancer due to the chewing of the skull. He had esophageal cancer, he actually passed away. Now, under this, if it's determined that it's, I don't want to say non-firefighter related, but let's say one of those situations, would it still be covered?
Sure, that's a great question. Maybe better suited for a workers' comp attorney, but I'll give you my pretend workers' comp attorney answer. So there is a number of other kind of benchmarks that need to be met within the presumptive language. There is some tobacco language. The member needs to live a tobacco-free lifestyle, and I believe that was taken from the Affordable Care Act language. And just because a member would be covered under presumptive workers' compensation language, all that does is simply shifts the burden of proof for an employer to prove, or a workers' comp insurer to prove that it did not come from the job. It's not to say that every single cancer would be covered under every circumstance.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sure.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your great testimony. We appreciate it. I have four other folks that signed in. Mike Rollo from American Cancer Society. All are in support. Chief Larry Best from the New Hampshire Association of Fire Chiefs. John McAllister from the Professional Firefighters of New Hampshire, and Jared O'Connor from Shaheen and Gordon. Any of you wish to speak? No? Okay. Anybody else that wishes to speak? Seeing none, we'll close the hearing on Senate Bill 71. So what is the will of the committee? I think we have some bills we could exec. I know I've got two that I brought amendments in from last week. So I'd entertain a motion to go into executive session. So moved. Do we have a second? Moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right, we are in executive session.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
What is the feeling of the committee to accept the bill we just heard, Senate Bill 71?
I would move up to pass.
All right, we have a motion about to pass on Senate Bill 71. I just have to find the right sheet here.
I can speak to my
Been moved and seconded. You did not, you guys are ahead of me a
I
little
would
bit.
happily allow Senator Carson to speak to my motion. if
All
you're
right,
Chair.
Senator Perkins
you.
Quoker defers, and you may speak to her motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support the ought to pass motion. As we heard in testimony, New Hampshire has taken steps to make sure that our firefighters get the help that they need because of exposure to occupational cancer. And I think it's important that we do realize that there are now other cancers that are not included on this list that we put into statute a few years ago. I do believe that there are exemptions, and I would like to thank Senator Gendro for bringing up the issue about tobacco, and Mr. Rill for Captain Rill, I should say, for answering those questions. It shows us that I believe that there are, it's common sense legislation, and it's about time that we recognize it. I will say, as someone who lives in an area that's affected by PFAS, and we have to have bottled water brought in, I can't imagine being a firefighter putting on a suit knowing that it has PFAS in it, and I'm subjecting myself to that. But they still do it anyway because they have a job to do. And I think it's time we start protecting the people that go out there and protect our lives every single day. And that's why I do believe that it's important that we pass this. I do like the idea of the commission because this is going to be ongoing as more time goes on and we learn more and more about occupational the occupational hazards that our first responders are subjected to every day. We just need to make sure that these folks are protected. And so for that reason, Mr. Chair, I wholeheartedly support the ought to pass on Senate Bill 71.
Thank you, Senator. Any further comments? Senator Perkins Quoker.
Yeah, just briefly, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator Carson. I think in Portsmouth, we have unfortunately been on the forefront of many of these discussions around PFAS, and so we know that these issues are going to continue to arise. I tragically had a coworker whose brother was a young father of 4. He was a lifetime firefighter. He was retired, passed away from a cancer that first affected the bones in his hips a couple years ago. And so we know this is happening in our communities around us, and I think we at the state, it's the least we can do to give our firefighters that presumption. So appreciate everyone's support on this.
Any further comments? Well, I'll just say that I would echo the sentiments of what we've heard from the two senators who have spoken. We certainly appreciate and respect all of you for what you provide to our communities. With that, we have a motion about to pass. Any further discussion? Are we ready to vote? I guess we'll vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. Anybody want to move consent, or do you want to speak on this on the floor?
I don't know. Do you want? I guess I'll speak. Okay.
Okay, so we won't put it on consent, and you'll
Yep,
take
and
the
I'll
bill
do
out?
it.
Okay.
Yep, that's fine.
Thank you, Senator Carson. What's everyone's feeling on Senate Bill 74? This had the changes that you had a question on. Okay, my thought was maybe we could exec it, and if there was found out there was a problem, we could do a floor amendment on floor. That way we could keep it moving forward. Would you be amenable to that? Or do you want to wait?
I'd like just a beat to review what
Okay.
the commissioner gave us
All right.
alongside the.
Well,
I know there's a lot in there.
yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may, can be a complicated question, and I'd rather have us struggle with that here in executive session than try to explain it on the floor.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I don't believe any of the other bills from today were ready to exec. Do you?
No.
Okay, so we have two amendments from two bills we had last week that I believe you have, Philip. The two amendments that I brought dealing with, switch pages here. We will start with Senate Bill 49, which is the non-lapsing fund for OPLC. And
Thank you.
it seemed to be the will of the committee to, oops, I'm sorry, this is the wrong one. Yep, that's all right. Now we'll have the right amendment. Thank you. So it was expressed in our hearings that we wanted to have some reporting ability from OPLC for the funds, how they're distributing the funds from the non-lapsing fund. And I went and spoke with the commissioner, I guess, Lindsay Courtney, and she had no objection to it whatsoever. So I had this amendment drafted, which would add about a report be generated biannually. Since their funds lapse biannually, I thought it was good to tie the report to that. And that would give some accountability to the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House, and the chairs of both ED&A in the House and Senate. This is amendment to 49, yes.
So it should be 0080.
So I offer this amendment for your consideration. I think this covered the concerns that we had or requests.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the concern was to ensure that a certain percentage of the funds that were retained were actually spent on reducing fees, but I found Director Courtney's testimony rather compelling on how, they were going to allocate things, and there are also some further changes Senator Carson mentioned, so I think this language addresses my concerns.
Okay. Any further comment? Senator Altshuler, could I have you turn your mic on? Thank you.
I also had a concern that there wasn't a reprioritization of expenditures to move the reduction of fees to the top of the list. Understand they have some capital expenses that they need to deal with, and salaries. I guess I'm hearing that you're comfortable with Dr. Courtney's recommendation.
Well, maybe Senator Carson can clarify
Yeah.
that
I sure can.
I think there was going to be some reform where each board was going to set its own fees to 25% of actual cost. So there was
Right.
some
Yeah,
reform
just to forewarn all of you, we're
Yeah.
going to be getting, I believe it is 67 pages of reorganization of the OPLC. Because,
Swell.
yeah, while the rest of you were having all kinds of fun this summer, guess where I was?
Okay.
So one of the things that we dealt with, there was policy on one side, fees on the other, and it was during that process
okay.
that we found out that a lot of these boards were all over the place. Many of them were going way beyond the 125% rule. And so we, in the policy section, which has been filed by Representative McGuire in the House, deals with standardizing that fee across the board, because we're going to give OPLC the ability to set the fee rather than the board. So Senator Lang, who was also on this, but he dealt with the fee side. So the changes that they want to make here are the changes that we agreed to. The policy section is over here. We won't see that hopefully until close to crossover or just after crossover. It's just that these two are working together, but they're just in different bodies. The only question that I had, Mr. Chairman, excuse me, is really one of the things that are part of the testimony was that the boards wanted to get this information as well.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if within this amendment we can, let's see, but July expended to the office or the president, I would probably maybe put applicable boards or something like that, because they need to also know how these fees were spent, because they're no longer going to be setting the fee. So I don't know how you folks feel about that.
Could we make it available, so it's available at the state library and to the governor, could we make it available online so that they could just review it? Would that cover what you need? Or do you
I
want
think
a
you
hard
can-
copy to?
I think it should be hard copied.
Okay.
You could, have it online and to the applicable boards or appropriate boards. Because during the commission, that was the one thing that they talked about, was the lack of communication between OPLC and these boards. So in order to facilitate that relationship, I do believe that since they're gonna, I don't remember if they're collecting it, I think they're collecting it, but the members are gonna wanna see how their fees are spent, which I think is completely appropriate.
Absolutely.
So it's just a matter of making that report available to the boards.
So I guess can we use the words applicable boards? Would that be acceptable?
Because if you're the board of nursing, what do you care what the the mechanical board, how they spent their fees?
Right.
They're not gonna care. They're just only gonna care about their particular board. Mr. George will report to the president,
I would say right after the end of the governor.
Yeah,
To
and
make
I
it
would cross
available.
out, and I would, the governor and applicable boards.
And make it available online.
So
I would say maybe take out the and, so the governor, comma, make available online, or applicable boards, excuse me, comma, and make available online.
Okay, that's fine.
Does that make sense?
Yep,
Okay.
that sure does.
Yeah, I started to read that bill a little bit. Boy, there's
Yeah.
a lot of pages to it.
Yep.
It's on my desk, and so if anybody's bored and wants to read it, make sure you have a couple of cups of coffee and a lot of time. There's a ton of stuff in there.
Yeah, there's a lot, and that's what happens when you reorganize.
So does this document come with a musical score? I mean,
You're gonna have, Senator, you're gonna have to provide your own.
Music not
You
for
can sing,
writing.
you can hum, you can play the piano while you read it. It's up to you.
there's got to be a better way to remember all this stuff.
So
right?
this is a little bit new to me, being able to make amendments in committee to an
Mhm.
amendment. The process, and I'm going to lean on you for a second. So the process, do
Okay.
we have to vote on the changed language to the amendment, or do we just change the
No,
language?
we're gonna vote on what is going to become a committee amendment.
Okay,
You're kind of working through this, because this was an unapproved draft.
Okay.
Okay, so we're gonna treat it as a draft.
got it.
With the changes, that will become the approved version. Our committee secretary is going to go and get that from OLS, and the changed version will be in the calendar.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that will be a motion for changes within the draft.
Okay, so do I need another motion to amend the amendment, or can I just, because we're,
I'm trying to think here,
Considering the amendment.
because usually Jenny knows.
Motion you need to make is that you will be voting on a committee amendment that includes the language of the amendment and the changes.
got it,
There you
okay,
go.
thank you.
Thank you,
That
Jenny.
is much easier than amending the amendment.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here going, I'm trying to remember what happens.
Thank
here.
you. That's the difference between the Senate and the House. 'Cause
Oh, yeah.
The House, we had to go get new amendments before we could vote on
We're,
them.
we're
All right,
much more flexible.
excellent.
And that way everyone knows what it is, and Jenny, because I think I drove Jenny crazy. What I would do is, before we vote, I would restate what the changes were, so everybody knew exactly what the changes were, because we are not going to have a physical copy in front of us as we vote. So my suggestion to you, Mr. Chairman, is just read where this is going to go and what the exact language is going to be, so we're all on the same page.
Absolutely, and if we're ready, I will do that. Is any further comments before I do?
No, sir.
Seeing none, all right, I'm going to just read the last sentence, because that is what we are changing. The office shall, beginning on line 11, the office shall forward the report to the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the chairs of the House and Senate executive departments and administrative committees, the state library, comma, the governor, comma, applicable boards, comma, and make available online, period.
There you go.
Do we have a motion?
I move on to pass on the committee amendment.
Do I have a second? Second? All right. Any further discussion? All right, so we have a motion on the committee amendment ought to pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Seeing none. So now we will move ought to pass as amended, correct, on Senate Bill
Yes,
49?
and
Do I have a motion?
I move on to pass as amended.
Moved by Senator Carson. Do we have it seconded by Senator Perkins Quoker? Any further comments? Seeing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Mr. Chair, move consent calendar.
We have consent moved. Do we have a second?
Second?
Senator Gendro? All those in favor of on the consent calendar? Aye.
Aye.
We can do that without, all right.
And I still have to have somebody to take it out, correct?
Yes, if you like, I will do that.
Senator Carson.
I will work with Phil on a blurb. Okay.
Next, we will move to Senate Bill 67. So I spoke with Commissioner Jasper and explained to him that the committee had concerns, especially about, I apologize, I got to get to the correct language here because all I have is the amendment.
Do we have copies of this available to the public? Because I know, okay, I think there's a member of the public that might.
Would you like a copy to
testified
read?
that he might want to take a look at the proposed amendment.
Here we go.
So while he's making you a copy, I'll explain what this does. This basically removes the section 2, which is what seemed to be giving most everyone the heartburn about the self-certification of scales. And it keeps, excuse me, actually it does more than that. 1 and 3. It moves section 2, and it also removed section 4. And so what it kept in, which was the right of entry powers, basically the police powers, where we also had some other concerns. And it keeps, I apologize, it keeps section 1 and section 3 intact, which are basically housekeeping portions of it. So if you're referring to the original bill, what will move forward is section 1, section 3.
Okay, so amend the bill.
Mr. Chair, I think that's, you're moving section, you're moving forward section 3 and 5.
I'm sorry, did I
That's
get
what
that
it
wrong?
looks like.
Did I remove?
Yeah, because section 3 deals with, it just looks like some language update concerning the investigation, and it really doesn't change anything except, his or her, and
Yes.
from he deems to just deemed, and then the commissioner or his inspectors at his direction, and it just says, under the direction of the commissioner, the director. So it's mostly, it looks like language changes, but it really doesn't change anything.
Correct.
And in section 5, dealing with field standards and equipment, it just updates it to intervals as recommended by the National Conference on Weights and Measures Handbook. And I don't believe we had any, and you're correct, any heartburn on those two sections. It was in section 2 and section 4 that I think that
Yes.
that's where we got the biggest pushback.
My apologies, the amendment had number 2 on it, and I was reading it
okay.
wrong. So, yes, that's correct.
Well, and just to clarify respectfully, I think that we're moving section 1, 3, and 5 of the original bill forward, right? Because
Yeah.
we're replacing all after section 1.
Yes, that's correct.
And
So we were
so-
removing section 2 and 4.
Correct.
That's
And-
what was getting me.
Agreed. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry for that. I thought I had it down
No
until I started reading it, and I confused
That's
myself.
okay. With all this and the minutia, it's very easy to get confused.
Okay,
So I will offer that amendment.
I don't have a record of having any concerns in sections 1 3 or 5.
Mr. Chair, the only thing that I am concerned about is in the new section 3 is the word interval. I mean,
Yeah.
what are we talking about when we're talking about interval? Before, everyone would know that
Intervals, yeah.
the field standard shall be verified upon their initial receipt, and at least once a year, they knew this was going to happen once a year. But with interval, who knows what the interval is? Is it every 3 months? Is it every month? Is it every 6 months? Is it every 2 years? I think it would be better for us if we had some sort of a definition what we're talking about as an interval.
Okay, I agree with you. I didn't catch that the first time I read it. Would you be comfortable with a 2-year interval?
Well, I don't know what would be an appropriate interval, because they're going from at least once a year to what?
Yeah.
And-
What is the
and-
recommendation
yeah,
by
we
the
don't-
conference? Do we know?
Yeah.
It could be that different field equipment has different recommended intervals, and so I think what they might be trying to say is at the interval that's a best practice according to this handbook.
I think this is a minor change, so I might suggest this, that we just let this go through and let the commissioner deal with it on the House side when it goes through there, if he wants to define that interval. Would everyone be okay with that? They have a second bite at it there. If there's, needs to be clarifying language on that interval, or do you have something that you want to offer?
Oh, you have a handbook.
Oh.
So it says as recommended, so there's a recommendation in there.
Right.
And what was taken out was at least. Now, we know that there's not enough capacity to be doing multiple multiple visits to check field standards, verification of field standards, but if we just leave it to the handbook, I mean,
But there's two. They use two different standards.
Right.
They has as recommended by the National Conference on Weights and Measures pursuant to RSA, that thereby by
or
thereafter by
standards
comparison
of
with the state
NIST.
standards or standards. So
thank you.
It can get, you're gonna use one or the other. Which one are you gonna use? And what is that interval? Because you could have one interval as recommended by the National Conference, but a different one recommended under the standards of NIST, which I don't know what organization that is as well.
And this is kind of
It's
saying
confusing.
that in the field during calibration, you might adjust your period where it needs to be recalibrated.
So what we're looking at is the 105 handbook.
Yeah.
And there's varying intervals depending on what the equipment is. And so it kind of gives some guidance within the handbook. And I think that's why they're saying at intervals as recommended by the National Conference on Weights and Measures Handbook 105 series, because it kind of gives some guidelines. I'll read just, if I may.
But what are the standards of NIST? Because that, they can use either or, one or the other. So if you're a business owner and you deal with weights and measures, how do you know which standard they're going to use? Is it going to be the National Conference on Weights and Measure Handbook or the standards of the NIST? And so how can you abide by it if you're not sure which standard they're going to use? It's confusing.
Maybe we should hold off on accepting this and see if we can get a clarification.
Okay.
Everybody good with that?
Yep.
Because I do see your question there.
Thank you, Jenny.
All right, so 67 holds.
Thank you, Jenny. Bless you.
Right.
We'll get there.
Okay, so we're all good on holding off on executing this today. Is there any other bills anyone wanted to exec? Because I think that's all the ones that I had. I'll accept a motion to come out of executive session.
So moved.
Seconded? It's moved and seconded. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And with that, I don't believe we have any further business today, so I will close the committee. It is 11 o'clock. We did well. Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess you did.
Sleep much for 2 days.
Yeah.
Just figured my body was run down.
Yeah.
Definitely feels good. All right.
Funny how our bodies work like that. All right.
Fair enough. I did not catch this.
No, no,